Well, welcome to Conversatorio Cubano. I have the entire editorial board of Cuban Studies, which is a journal founded in 1971 at the University of Pittsburgh, and it is now in its 55th, 56th year. We have published very recently the new edition under our editorial board's leadership, 55. And we are on the cusp of seeing the very next 56 come out. So I'm honored to have Professor Michael Bustamante, Professor Jennifer Lambe, and Dr. Daniel Fernández Guevara here. I would love to hear from each of you, and I have some very good, I think, questions lined up. And we can do a round robin with each of you answering one question. So I think we should get started. So let me start with Professor Michael Bustamante. In our scholarship, I think also as editors of Cuban studies, it is often the case that Cuban history is more than just a factor in the development of political events in Cuba or about Cuba. It's kind of a protagonist. So I wonder if you could speak to that and whether you agree that Cuban history is a protagonist in the development and perhaps interpretation of current events.
Sure. Well, good to be with you, Lily, and colleagues. Um, Not to be too self-referential, but I feel like this question is almost unfair for someone who wrote a book called Cuban Memory Wars, which is about precisely how the fight over Cuban history is always a protagonist in the Cuban present. And I think that's gone into overdrive in some sense in the last few weeks. It's always been true, right? It's been true in particularly dramatic ways in light of Cuba's crisis now for 5, 6 years. But particularly since the capture of Nicolas Maduro in January, and all the sort of talk about whether Cuba is next, and predictions of imminent change or things like that. So it's interesting. I mean, history is everywhere as an actor. On the one hand, President Trump himself has referred to history in some sense in the notion that I think the quote is something like, "I've been hearing about Cuba my whole life." And I think in contrast to, say, the case in Venezuela, where natural resource wealth was such an obvious part of the motivation for the president in doing what they've done, um, I think it's pretty certain that this would have been sold. The idea of Cuba being next, whatever that may or may not mean, it would have been sold to this president as also an opportunity to do something that no other president had done in history, which is to end Cuban communism. Whether they get there is a very different question. So I think on the U.S. side, yes, there's all sorts of history is playing a protagonist here in a big way. And then, of course, on the Cuban side, in light of the revival of the Trump administration's not just rhetoric that recalls the rhetoric of U.S. imperialism in the late 19th century, in light of the president's advocacy for once again treating Cuba and Latin America as a United States sphere of influence, talking openly about invoking something that he's calling the Don Roe Doctrine. It's not a surprise that Cuban authorities are responding with their own historical narratives of caution, right? That what's coming is an attempt to push us back, to rewind the clock to a time that was simply dark and dangerous and oppressive for the Cuban people. So history is everywhere, but I think for the Cuban people right now, what I sense, and again, one has to be careful to generalize. There are people in Cuba who are shocked and horrified by the rhetoric coming from the U.S. administration, but there's also a lot of people who don't care so much about history at this juncture. It seems to me there's such a deep crisis and such a deep desire for just something, anything to kind of break the logjam, that I have heard from folks I know on the island that even are aware of sort of the historical parallels with the 19th century and the ways in which Cuba becoming a U.S. client state once again could be it's not something that they ever hope for. If it breaks the inertia, they're almost willing to take that bet and live to fight another day for the causes that they care about. And that I find is really striking. I also find that on the island, and certainly in the Cuban diaspora, there's a bigger constituency for a kind of a simplistic restorationist view, right? Uh, the kind of Cubified version of Trump's slogan, "Make Cuba Great Again," harkening back to sort of a glory days that supposedly was lost. And that, I think, reflects a real lack of historical consciousness on the part of newer generations, who all that they know is the crisis in which they've grown up to greater or lesser intensity over the last, 3 decades, frankly, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And so it's easier for them to say, "Make Cuba great again." Look at these AI videos that are making Havana look once again like it did supposedly in the 1950s, without a critical consciousness that the Cuban Revolution came from somewhere, and so some of the perils that may be at stake. So I don't know. It's a paradoxical moment. History both feels everywhere, but also um, kind of a lesser concern in some people's minds, or just something that people are willing to look past, so long as there's progress or some kind of hope for change, whatever the risks of that change may be.
Mhm. Very good. I mean, I could say something right now, but I feel like you've covered all the bases, and in some ways, what we need to do is meditate on how history is at work here, and the denial of history itself is really, I think, to the detriment of the ability of the actors, the historical, political actors, which are both simultaneously right now, to do the best thing. Um, and we'll see what, I guess, what transpires in the next few months. I think too that because this panel is assembled today to talk about what is the role of academia, the next question for Professor Jennifer Lamb speaks to the kind of urgency that perhaps all academics who are specialists of Cuba, who have lived in Cuba repeatedly or were born in Cuba, feel about the need to speak, and to record and to kind of archive where we are as a community, transnationally and in other ways. So the journal was founded in 1971. It was founded at a time when most Cuba observers, what were often called Cuba watchers, journalists, officials, policymakers, and then of course Cubans abroad themselves, um, scoffed at the possibility that a journal that devoted itself to Cuban studies could have a role in the discussion of what Cuba was enduring and what its past and future were, and how they mattered in that process. So I wonder what you think about that, Professor Lamb. What is the role of a journal, but what is the role of Cuban studies in this kind of a context?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question and thank you for this conversation. In a way, I feel like the moment in front of us is not so different from the one in which the journal was founded. You used the word urgency. I think that's right. The journal was founded in some ways at a kind of nadir of bilateral engagement between Cuba and the United States. It was founded at a moment when it had been very difficult to conduct serious academic scholarship in Cuba for an extended period of time, whether we're talking here about foreigners in Cuba or Cubans in Cuba, because of the very challenging economic and political circumstances of the late 1960s. And so it feels like an appropriate moment, actually, to revisit that kind of founding narrative of the journal, which was founded originally as a kind of bibliographical outlet because it was assumed that the participants wouldn't be able to agree on anything else except for the need for a kind of shared basis for conversation. And, that is what the journal has continued to offer since then, a shared basis for conversation, which is not to say it conveyed agreement or consensus. Most of the time it did not. And the founders very much had that in mind. The goal was to provide a template for respectful disagreement across disciplinary lines, ideological lines, so long as everybody who was part of the conversation remained committed to some of the grounding rules of that conversation. The language at the time being one of objectivity and evidence driven analysis. Objectivity, of course, as a category has maybe fared a little bit less well. It's certainly not a word I think that is thrown around very often in our contemporary media environment, a media environment driven by hot takes, by sound bites, by bombast. In fact, it would seem to be a kind of uniquely unpropitious time to try to have conversations premised on balance and even exchange across ideological and political differences. And you add to that again a renewed context of now pretty long-standing economic and political crisis, renewed bilateral hostility. Right, it's kind of the feeling of redux almost, that we're returning to the founding conditions of our journal as we approach our tenure as editors. But I actually think, once again, this is exactly where academic scholarship is poised to make a difference, to offer context, to understand precedent, to make sure that even as we feel like we're reliving history, that we're not, right? Precisely because we know where we've been. And I think, Mike talked a lot about historical consciousness and its presence or absence, but the journal itself archives that history, right? It archives the debates, it archives the conversations. So at the very least, we scholars can be aware of those who've come before us, and not relive too much their battles, hopefully. I think academic scholarship also pushes us beyond parlor politics. And I think a lot of what is circulating in the media, but in policy circles with respect to Cuba right now, comes back to who and when and what they're doing. And that's not to say that scholars don't have something to say about parlor politics. I'm sure they do. But I think that necessarily we're also invested in a broader analytical and narrative frame that doesn't just include one, two, three, or four people, which I take also as a kind of metaphor for the political conjuncture itself. How could the solution to a crisis like this one be a matter of one, two, or three, or four people, right? No, we have to step back and understand an entire population of a country that includes the now quite populated diaspora as a result of the significant outmigration of the last few years. So I think, once again, Cuban studies has to rise to the occasion to bring scholars together across not only potentially ideological differences, but disciplinary differences. Once more, what happens when the social scientists talk to the humanists, what kinds of conversations can emerge out of that? And to provide, once again, evidence-driven, grounded perspectives on Cuba's past and present. The temptation is to chase the news cycle. I think everybody feels it. To move fast, right? To respond to the now. And fortunately or unfortunately, for a publication that's published once a year, we can't do that, right? So how do we turn that fact into a benefit and an advantage? We get to move slowly. We get to be intentional. And we get to rely on the tools that our disciplines offer us, and especially what comes out of double-blind peer review, the opportunity to have work vetted seriously by people who have taken seriously the job of trying to understand Cuba in all of those different dimensions. It's not flashy. Double-blind peer review is not flashy. But I think it's really important because what it offers is a tool not to just respond to the now, but to offer perspectives that can also inform the conversation about Cuba's future and of Cuba's future, right? To produce that template and that archive that 10 or 20 years from now, people can rediscover anew.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank now publicly Dr. Daniel Fernandez, who served as a human bridge between the previous editorial board that was headed by our colleague and friend Alejandro Lafuente and our editorial board. And so, Daniel, you've kind of seen it all. You're the most veteran in so many respects of the process of editing. And so, as the managing editor now and in the past, you've also been a witness to some of the changes we've made in the journal. And they include new sections, one of which is devoted somewhat to oral histories, another which is new, entirely new, and devoted to images, especially photography. So I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about what are your favorite changes, or what are the sections of the journal that you find to be the most inspiring, since you have also been at the helm there of crafting this new kind of vision for the journal.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I This is very difficult. If the question is to pick one, it's almost like choosing among my children, right? Which one would you prefer? But if I had to answer the question that you asked, is the Voces section is to me is a very dynamic section. The way the journal was set up before, the current editorial team, I think was perfect for the moment. I think there are new opportunities with new media, new access to sources. The fact that historians or other people who work not only in the humanities but that contribute to our journal have found, because of the situation on the island, have found Cuba in other places, whether those are through oral histories, whether it's through court cases, in poetry. And so, what I really like about the Voces section, where you were the editor for Cuban Studies, the 55, um, is is that it allowed to have oral histories with everyday citizens, um, diplomatic people who are diplomats, and in the forthcoming volume, that expands even more. And what I love about it is it's deeply interdisciplinary, which is one of our goals. It reflects the broad interests of our readership, and the section goes beyond the conference panel at a conference and takes us to the sources and has that expert, which Professor Lamb talked to us about, give commentary on those sources, which I think gives an added weight to it, because in a published article, there isn't necessarily the space to have that deep dive when it's when I think in many cases we are left wondering. But I think these sources can come to life that way. Um, I also think that there are other parts, other sections that we've made come alive. I think the book review section, the book review essays the fact that we've expanded those. I love the idea of using photography as we've employed thus far. And the conversations are always forward thinking. So these new sections reflect what we feel is appropriate for the moment to have those scholarly conversations. But we're always also having conversations about which way we can make the journal more accessible to the broadest audience. And I think that that is evident in the types of dossiers we are not only eliciting but receiving proposals for. It's we've included ourselves, not ourselves being this editorial team, but the past editorial team. Your interview with Alejandro La Fuente is, I think, something that is fantastic because it
In
gives,
volume 55.
in volume 55, thank you, is fantastic. And it not only is it engaging, but many of us who've worked with Alejandro La Fuente didn't know half of that. And so it's almost like, I think, like we occurred with Cuban studies, where eventually the people who studied Cuba, it serves to take a light up to those people who studied Cuba as well as historical subjects, and we are doing that too. So I'm sorry for the long-winded answer. You said pick one, but I'd have to go with Voces. But every other one is a 1B. So thank you, Lily.
No, it's wonderful. And of course, no analysis coming from a Cuban about Cuba is too long-winded. I mean, that's just a rule that we live by. So thank you so much for contributing to Conversatorio Cubano. And thank you for all your excellent, extraordinary contributions to the scholarship and to the Journal of Cuban Studies.
Thank you, Lily.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lily.